The year is 1965. You wake in your suburban bedroom, not to an alarm, but to a gnawing sensation in your chest. The autumn light filters through pastel curtains onto the floral wallpaper your husband chose. Downstairs, breakfast needs making. Lunches need packing. The children are stirring. Your husband expects coffee, eggs, toast with the crusts cut off, exactly as his mother made them. But your hands are trembling. Your heart races for no reason at all. The doctor has a name for this, anxiety, and he has a solution. A little yellow pill, 5 milligrams of diazepam, brand name, Valium. He writes the prescription with barely a glance, tells you to take one twice daily, maybe 3 times if you need it. It's perfectly safe, he assures you, his pen already moving to the next form. All the women are taking it. And he's right. By the end of this decade, Valium will be the most prescribed drug in America. By 1978, 2.3 billion pills will be swallowed in a single year. But right now, in this moment, you don't know that this little yellow pill will become your master. You don't know about the dependence, the withdrawal, the decades of suffering that will follow. You just know that for the first time in months, you might feel calm. This is the story of Valium, and it's darker than you ever imagined. Before we dive deep into this story, if you're new here, welcome to the channel. We explore history's darkest corners, the brutal truths, the uncomfortable realities, the stories that textbooks skip over. If you find yourself drifting off during this video, that's exactly what we want. This is history for sleep, after all. But if you're still awake, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. And if this video helps you understand something about our past, or about the prescription pill epidemic we're still living through today, leave a comment below. Your stories matter. Tonight, we're spending 2 hours examining the complete history of Valium, from its accidental discovery in a cluttered laboratory in 1955, through its golden age as America's favorite drug, to the modern benzodiazepine crisis that's killing tens of thousands every year. We'll meet the chemist who invented it, the women who are prescribed it by the millions, the celebrities who died from it, and the survivors who are still fighting to be believed about withdrawal symptoms that can last for years. This is a story about medicine, marketing, gender, power, and the price we pay when we try to chemically eliminate human suffering. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. To understand Valium, you need to understand the world before it existed. Not the 1950s you see in colorized photographs and nostalgic television shows, but the real 1950s, a decade of profound psychological pressure disguised as prosperity. The year is 1955. The war has been over for a decade, but its ghosts remain. Your father, if he served, doesn't talk about what he saw in Europe or the Pacific. He came home, got a job at the factory or the office, married your mother, bought a house in the new suburbs sprouting like mushrooms on former farmland, and set about creating the nuclear family that politicians and advertisers promised would heal the nation's wounds. Your mother, if she worked during the war, riveting aircraft fuselages or calculating ballistics trajectories, has been firmly ushered back into the home. Rosie the Riveter has become Betty the homemaker, and the transition has not been smooth. This is the age of conformity. Everyone is supposed to want the same things: a house with a white picket fence, a station wagon, 2.3 children, a husband who commutes to a good job, a wife who greets him at the door with a martini and a smile. On television, families are perfect. Problems resolve themselves in 30 minutes. Mothers wear pearls to vacuum. No one ever screams or weeps or feels the walls closing in. But you, if you're a woman in 1955, might feel something else entirely. You might wake up with your heart pounding, your hands clammy, a sensation of impending doom that has no rational cause. The medical establishment has a term for this: housewife syndrome, or nerves, or hysteria, that ancient diagnosis that's been applied to women since the Greeks. Your husband doesn't understand. What do you have to be anxious about? He asks, genuinely baffled. You have everything. And on paper you do. So why does it feel like you're suffocating? The truth, which Betty Friedan will articulate in 1963 in The Feminine Mystique, the same year Valium launches,
is that millions of educated, capable women have been shoehorned into a role that doesn't fit. You were told that fulfillment comes from a spotless home and well-behaved children. You were told that wanting anything else makes you selfish, neurotic, unfeminine. You were told to smile and be grateful. And when you couldn't, when the desperation leaked out anyway, the medical system had solutions. Chemical solutions. Before Valium,
there was Milltown, the first blockbuster tranquilizer, approved in 1955. Named after the New Jersey town where it was developed, meprobamate became a cultural phenomenon almost overnight. By 1957, 1 in 20 Americans had tried it. Celebrities praised it, advertisements promised it would ease nervous tension and modern anxiety. But Milltown had problems. It was habit-forming, the dose needed to feel its effects crept upward, and there were overdoses, blackouts, disturbing side effects. Before Milltown, there were barbiturates, powerful sedatives that had been around since the early 1900s. Barbiturates worked, certainly. They quieted the mind, induced sleep, smoothed away anxiety. They also killed. The line between a therapeutic dose and a fatal one was distressingly thin. Barbiturates were involved in countless accidental overdoses and intentional suicides. When Marilyn Monroe was found dead on August 5, 1962, the autopsy revealed acute barbiturate poisoning, a mix of chloral hydrate and pentobarbital, specifically Nembutal, at levels several times the prescribed dose. The official ruling was probable suicide, though conspiracy theories have swirled ever since. What isn't disputed is that barbiturates were dangerous, unpredictable, and widely available. The medical community knew it needed something better, something that could calm anxiety and induce sleep without the overdose risk of barbiturates or the addictive problems of Milltown. Something that seemed safe enough to prescribe liberally, especially to women who were visiting doctors' offices in droves complaining of nerves, tension, insomnia, vague bodily pains that had no physical cause. Into this world of Cold War anxiety, gender role rigidity, and pharmaceutical experimentation, came a Polish-Jewish chemist named Leo Sternbach, working in a laboratory in Nutley, New Jersey. He was looking for a better tranquilizer. What he found would change the world. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you need to understand the pressure cooker of 1950s America, the specific cultural forces that created such desperate demand for a drug like Valium. Because Valium didn't create a problem, it offered a solution to a problem that already existed, a problem of anxiety and despair that was epidemic but invisible, suffered primarily by women whose pain was dismissed as trivial, emotional, probably their own fault. Imagine a typical day. The year is 1958. You're 28 years old, married for 6 years, mother to 2 young children. Your husband leaves for work at 7:30 a.m. You've already been up for an hour, dressed, makeup applied, hair pinned, breakfast prepared. The children need feeding, washing, dressing, the breakfast dishes need clearing, the beds need making, there's laundry to wash, hang, bring in, fold, floors to sweep and mop, groceries to buy, dinner to plan and prepare, something that takes hours because you're making everything from scratch, bread, pie crust, mayonnaise. Your husband will be home at 6 p.m., expecting the house to be spotless, the children clean and quiet, dinner ready, and you smiling, pleasant, interested in his day, never complaining about yours. There's no dishwasher, no microwave, no ready-made meals. The washing machine, if you have one, is a ringer model that requires constant supervision. You have no career, no income of your own, no legal recourse if your husband is cruel or unfaithful. Divorce is scandalous, financially ruinous, and in many states legally difficult without proving adultery or abuse. Your entire identity is wife and mother. Your entire purpose is service, and you're not supposed to mind. But you do mind. You lie awake at night, heart racing, wondering if this is all there is. You snap at your children over small things, then hate yourself for it. You feel a scream building in your chest that never finds release. So you go to the doctor, and the doctor, a kindly man who has known you since you were a girl, pats your hand and tells you this is normal. All women feel this way sometimes, and writes you a prescription. For Milltown in 1958, for Librium starting in 1960, for Valium starting in 1963. The pills help. They really do. The tight band around your chest loosens, the racing thoughts slow. You can breathe again. You can smile at your husband and mean it, or at least fake it convincingly.
You can be the woman everyone expects you to be. And that's exactly the problem. Let's go deeper into this world, this pressure cooker of expectations and silence that created the perfect market for Valium. Because the drug didn't appear in a vacuum. It appeared in response to an epidemic of female suffering that doctors were eager to treat and pharmaceutical companies were eager to profit from. The 1950s are often remembered as a golden age: post-war prosperity, economic boom, the rise of the middle class, suburban expansion, technological marvels making life easier. And for many Americans,
particularly white middle-class families, there was genuine prosperity. Jobs were plentiful, wages rose. A single income could support a family, buy a house, fund a comfortable life. The GI Bill sent millions of men to college. The interstate highway system opened up the country. Television brought the world into living rooms. Polio vaccines saved children's lives. Antibiotics defeated infections that would have killed previous generations. Things were, by many measures, genuinely better. But prosperity has its own anxieties. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. The Cold War was a constant low-level terror, with schoolchildren practicing duck and cover drills and families considering backyard bomb shelters. McCarthyism created an atmosphere of suspicion and conformity. Anyone who seemed different, who questioned the status quo, could be accused of communist sympathies and destroyed. The very abundance of choices, which car to buy, which appliances to install, which neighborhood to settle in, created pressure to choose correctly, to keep up with the neighbors, to signal success through consumption. And for women specifically, the contradictions were suffocating. During World War II, women had flooded into the workforce. 6 million women who had never worked before took jobs in factories, offices, and farms. They welded ships, built aircraft, ran machinery, proved themselves capable of any task. Rosie the Riveter became an icon. But when the men came home, women were expected to step aside. Propaganda that had celebrated female workers now celebrated female homemakers. Magazine articles and advice columns instructed women that their highest calling was creating a perfect home for husband and children. Working outside the home, particularly if you had young children, was seen as selfish, even damaging to your family. Ambition was unfeminine. Intelligence needed to be hidden. Your job was support, not achievement. For women who had tasted independence and capability during the war, this was a bitter pill. For younger women who had been educated and female college enrollment had been rising steadily, being told that their highest purpose was waxing floors and packing lunches felt like waste. But the culture was unambiguous. Femininity meant domesticity. Deviation from this norm meant you were maladjusted, neurotic, possibly frigid, certainly a bad wife and mother. The experts, psychologists, doctors, ministers, advice columnists, all agreed. Women who weren't satisfied in domestic roles had something wrong with them. Enter the concept of housewife syndrome or housewife neurosis, terms that began appearing in medical literature in the early 1950s. Doctors reported seeing increasing numbers of middle-class women complaining of anxiety, depression, unexplained physical symptoms, insomnia, and a vague sense of despair. The symptoms were real, the suffering was genuine, but the medical establishment's interpretation was that these women were failing to adjust to their natural roles. The problem wasn't the role itself, it was the woman's inability to accept it. The solution, therefore, was to medicate the woman into acceptance. Advertisements for Milltown and later for Librium and Valium make this absolutely explicit. They show harried housewives, overwhelmed mothers, aging single women, menopausal women struggling with the change. The message is always the same. This woman has a problem, anxiety, depression, tension, and this pill will fix her so she can return to her proper function. One advertisement for Librium from 1970 shows an angry-looking woman and reads, "You can't set her free, but you can help her feel less anxious." Another shows a young woman in a graduation gown with the caption, "Leaving college to enter a new world of adult conflicts?" The drug is positioned as the solution to women's failure to fit their assigned roles comfortably. Consider the numbers. Between 1965 and 1970, 47.2 million psychotropic drug prescriptions were dispensed under Britain's National Health Service. The vast majority went to women. In America, by the mid-1960s, women were being prescribed benzodiazepines like Librium and Valium at twice the rate of men. By the mid-1970s, when Valium had become America's most prescribed drug, with over 100 million prescriptions per year, the majority of those prescriptions were going to women, not because women were inherently more anxious or neurotic, but because the medical establishment viewed women's dissatisfaction as a medical problem requiring chemical intervention, while viewing men's dissatisfaction as a reasonable response to life's challenges.
There's a word for this, gender bias in prescribing, and it was blatant. Pharmaceutical company advertisements, which appeared in medical journals and were aimed directly at physicians, overwhelmingly depicted women as the patients needing tranquilizers. They showed women in domestic settings, women failing to cope with children or housework.
Women whose emotions were out of control. The implicit and often explicit message was that women needed help controlling their unruly emotions, while men needed strength and clarity. Stimulants and pep pills were marketed to men. Tranquilizers and sedatives were marketed to women. Let's look at a specific example, one of the most notorious pharmaceutical advertisements ever created. In 1970, Roche, the manufacturer of Valium, ran an advertisement in the Archives of General Psychiatry, a medical journal read by doctors, not patients. The ad features a series of photographs documenting a woman named Jan from age 20 to 35. At 20, Jan is pictured with a young man at what appears to be a college social event. At 23, she's on a date with a different man. At 27, she's shown in professional attire, possibly working. At 30, she's at a cocktail party, glass in hand, looking uncomfortable. At 35, she stands alone on the deck of a cruise ship, middle-aged, solitary, gazing out to sea. The text reads, 35, single, and psychoneurotic. It goes on to describe Jan as suffering from low self-esteem and an inability to form lasting relationships with men, specifically citing her inability to find a man who measures up to her father. The solution offered by the advertisement is Valium, which can help Jan manage her anxiety and neurosis. The subtext is clear. Jan's problem is that she's unmarried at 35, and Valium can make her tractable enough to catch a husband. This advertisement is shocking by modern standards, but it wasn't an outlier. It was typical. Another ad from the same period shows a woman sitting primly with hands folded with the caption, "You can't set her free, but you can help her feel less anxious." The implication is that the woman's confinement, whether in an unhappy marriage, a stultifying domestic role, or a limited life, is unchangeable, but her emotional response to that confinement can be chemically managed. The problem isn't the cage. The problem is the bird's refusal to stop beating her wings against the bars. These advertisements worked. Doctors prescribed Valium by the millions, often with barely a conversation. A woman came in complaining of anxiety, insomnia, tension headaches, crying spells, a sense of being overwhelmed, all symptoms that might have been addressed through therapy, social support, changes in life circumstances, or simply acknowledgement that her feelings were valid responses to difficult situations, and she left with a prescription for Valium, 2 5-milligram tablets daily, sometimes more, refills authorized, take as needed, no warnings about dependence, no discussions of alternative treatments. The transaction took minutes. Why did doctors prescribe so freely? Several reasons. First, they believed the drug was safe. Hoffmann-La Roche, the pharmaceutical company that manufactured Valium, had conducted studies, funded by Roche itself, showing that benzodiazepines were non-addictive and had minimal side effects. The risk of overdose death was extremely low, especially compared to barbiturates. The drug seemed to work, patients reported feeling better, and frankly, doctors in the 1950s and 60s didn't have many tools for addressing anxiety and depression. Psychotherapy was time-consuming, expensive, and still somewhat stigmatized. Hospitalization was for severe cases. Barbiturates were dangerous. Valium seemed like a miracle, effective, safe, easy. Second, the pharmaceutical industry had cultivated very close relationships with doctors. Drug company representatives, known as detail men, visited doctors' offices regularly, bringing samples, literature, and gifts. They took doctors to dinner, sponsored conferences, funded research. The information doctors received about drugs came largely from the companies that manufactured them. Independent research was limited, critical voices were few. If Roche said Valium was safe and non-addictive, most doctors believed it. Third, and most importantly, doctors shared the cultural biases of their time. Most doctors in the 1950s and 60s were men. They had been trained in a medical system that viewed women as inherently more emotional, less rational, more prone to hysteria and neurosis. The idea that women needed chemical help to manage their emotions fit comfortably into existing prejudices. A woman complaining of anxiety wasn't seen as someone responding reasonably to unreasonable pressures. She was seen as someone who needed to be calmed down so she could fulfill her duties. Prescribing Valium was from this perspective compassionate. It helped women cope. It made them feel better. What was the harm? We would find out. Let's go back to the beginning, to the man who created Valium, often without understanding what he had unleashed. His name was Leo Sternbach, and his story is one of escape, exile, and accidental genius.
Leo Sternbach was born on May 7, 1908, in Opatija, a coastal resort town in what was then Austria-Hungary, now Croatia. His father,
Michael Abraham Sternbach, was a pharmacist from Przemyśl in Galicia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now Poland. His mother, Piroska Kohn Sternbach, was from Orosháza, Hungary. The family was Jewish, upper-middle class, comfortable. They lived in a rented four-room apartment above the pharmacy Michael owned, the Villa Jadran, or Villa Adriatic. Leo had a younger brother, Jussi, whom he adored. Leo's childhood was marked by education and displacement. He attended a private German school in Opatija until it closed in 1920. Opatija had become part of Italy after World War I, and German institutions were being shuttered. Since Leo couldn't speak Italian, he was sent to continue his education in Villach, Graz, and Bielitz, German-speaking cities in Austria and Poland. In 1926, when Leo was 18, the family moved to Krakow, Poland, the ancient city that had once been Poland's capital. That same year, tragedy struck. Leo's younger brother Jussi died of scarlet fever at age 15. The loss marked Leo deeply. He would later say that his work became a way to channel grief into something useful. In Krakow, Leo enrolled at Jagiellonian University, one of Europe's oldest and most prestigious institutions. He completed a master's degree in pharmacy in 1929 and a doctoral degree in organic chemistry in 1931. His doctoral research focused on synthetic dyes and their chemical structures, esoteric work, highly technical, the kind of deep chemistry that requires both patience and brilliance. In 1937, he received a scholarship from the Felix Wyslicki Foundation and moved to Vienna, then to Zurich, continuing his research into the structure of complex organic molecules. In Zurich, Sternbach worked with Leopold Rajicka, a Croatian-Swiss chemist who would win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1939 for his work on polymethylenes and higher terpenes. It was world-class training with a world-class scientist. Sternbach was on track for an academic career, perhaps a professorship, a life of research and teaching. And then the world collapsed. On September 1, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Within weeks, Krakow was under German occupation. Jewish institutions were destroyed. Jewish intellectuals were targeted. Sternbach's uncle, Leon Sternbach, a professor of classical philology at Jagiellonian University, was arrested on November 6, 1939, along with 183 other professors and academics, in an operation called Sonderaktion Krakow, Special Action Krakow. They were told they were being invited to a lecture on German policy toward Polish universities. Instead, they were arrested and deported to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Leon Sternbach died there in 1940, murdered by Gustav Sorge, one of the camp guards. Leo Sternbach, fortunately, was not in Poland. He was in Switzerland, which remained neutral, but his mother Piroska was in Krakow, hiding, surviving the occupation with the help of Polish neighbors who risked their lives to shelter her. Leo's father Michael had died before the war. His brother was already gone. The family Leo had known was being destroyed. On June 1, 1940, Sternbach started working for Hoffmann La Roche, the pharmaceutical giant based in Basel, Switzerland. It was a lifeline, steady work, a research position, a future. He threw himself into chemistry with the intensity of someone who has lost everything else. In 1941, Roche transferred him to their facility in Nutley, New Jersey, a leafy suburb west of New York City. America was not yet in the war, but it would be soon. Sternbach arrived with his wife Hertha Kreuzer, whom he had married in Switzerland. They settled in Upper Montclair, New Jersey, where they would live for the next 60 years. At Roche's Nutley laboratory, Sternbach was assigned to the search for new antibiotics, then new tranquilizers. The 1950s were a boom time for pharmaceutical research. Companies were looking for the next penicillin, the next breakthrough drug. Tranquilizers were a particularly promising area. Milltown had proven there was enormous demand, and the drugs manufacturer, Wallace Laboratories, was making a fortune. Roche wanted its own tranquilizer. Sternbach's approach was methodical. He revisited a class of compounds he had worked on during his doctoral research in Krakow in the 1930s, compounds called benzheptoxdiazines. They were dye intermediates, not drugs, but Sternbach thought they might have biological activity. He synthesized about 40 different variations, testing each one. None showed any promising effects. The project was a failure. In 1957, Roche told Sternbach to move on to other work. The benzheptoxdiazine compounds were shelved, forgotten, left to gather dust in the laboratory. This is where the legend begins, and like many legends, it's partly true. In May 1957, a laboratory technician named Earl Reeder was cleaning up Sternbach's workspace, which had become cluttered during 2 years of unsuccessful experiments. Reeder came across a crystalline
compound, nicely formed, sitting in a beaker.
It was one of the benzheptoxadiazines that had never been tested. Rather than throw it away, Reeder mentioned it to Sternbach. Almost as an afterthought, Sternbach decided to submit it for testing in animals. It was labeled RO5-0690. The results were startling. RO5-0690 showed strong sedative, muscle relaxant, and anticonvulsant effects in mice and cats. Unlike barbiturates, it didn't seem to depress respiration or cardiac function significantly. Unlike Milltown, it was more potent and longer lasting. Sternbach and his colleague Lowell Randall rushed the compound through additional testing. They discovered something remarkable. RO5-0690 wasn't actually a benzheptoxadiazine at all. The synthesis had taken an unexpected turn, creating a different ring structure, a 1.4 benzodiazepine. Sternbach had accidentally invented an entirely new class of drugs. Hoffmann-La Roche patented the compound in 1958 and began clinical trials. It was given the generic name chlordiazepine oxide and the brand name Librium, derived from equilibrium. On February 24, 1960, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved Librium for anxiety and tension. It was an immediate success, prescribed widely, praised by doctors, tolerated well by patients. But Roche wasn't finished. Sternbach and his team began synthesizing related compounds, looking for a benzodiazepine that was even more potent with fewer side effects. In 1959, they synthesized a compound labeled RO5-2807. It was simpler than Librium, more elegant chemically, and in animal tests, it was 5 times more potent. This was diazepam. Roche named it Valium, possibly derived from the Latin valere, meaning to be strong or healthy. The FDA approved Valium on November 15, 1963, exactly 1 week before President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, an event that would plunge the nation into grief and anxiety, creating the perfect emotional climate for a powerful anti-anxiety drug. Valium had several advantages over Librium. It was more potent, so smaller doses were needed. It had a longer half-life, meaning it stayed in the system longer and provided more consistent relief. It also had muscle relaxant properties, making it useful for conditions beyond anxiety, muscle spasms, seizures, alcohol withdrawal. Doctors loved its versatility, patients loved how it made them feel, and Hoffmann-La Roche, which held the patents, loved the profits. Leo Sternbach continued working at Roche for another decade, synthesizing more benzodiazepines. He would eventually create chlordiazepine, Librium, diazepam, Valium, flurazepam, Dalmane, a sleep aid, nitrazepam, Mogadon, flunitrazepam, or Hypnol, which would become notorious as a date rape drug, clonazepam, Klonopin, used for seizures and anxiety, and others. He held 241 patents over his career. His discoveries turned Hoffmann-La Roche into one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. Between 1969 and 1982, Valium was the single most prescribed drug in the United States. In 1978, at the peak, 2.3 billion Valium tablets were dispensed in America alone. Did Sternbach become wealthy from his inventions? No. He was a salaried employee of Roche, not an entrepreneur. He received no royalties. His salary was comfortable, but not extravagant. He lived modestly in the same house in Upper Montclair, New Jersey for 60 years. He drove himself to the Roche laboratory in Newtley every day until he was 95 years old, still consulting, still tinkering with molecules, still in love with chemistry. When asked late in life about his legacy, he said simply, "I always did just what I wanted to do." Chemistry for Sternbach was a passion, not a business. He loved the elegance of molecular structures, the satisfaction of synthesis, the intellectual puzzle of creating something new. He died on September 28, 2005, in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where he had moved to be near family in his final years. He was 97 years old. His obituaries called him a genius, a lifesaver, the inventor of Valium. They noted that his drugs had brought relief to millions suffering from anxiety, insomnia, seizures, muscle spasms. They mentioned his 241 patents, his induction into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in February 2005, just months before his death. What they often didn't mention, or mentioned only briefly, was the other side of his legacy. The millions of people who became dependent on the drugs he invented, the withdrawal syndrome that can last months or years, the lives damaged or destroyed by benzodiazepines. Did Sternbach know? Did he understand as he worked in his laboratory that he was creating a class of drugs that would addict millions? Probably not in the beginning. The early research suggested benzodiazepines were safe, non-addictive, far better than barbiturates. It wasn't until the late 1970s and early 1980s when the evidence became undeniable that the medical community acknowledged.
that benzodiazepines caused physical dependence and that withdrawal could be severe. By then, Sternbach was in his 70s, retired from active research. His drugs were already embedded in medical practice worldwide. You can't uninvent a molecule. Sternbach's story is a reminder that scientists create tools. How those tools are used, how they're marketed, prescribed, regulated, understood, is beyond the scientist's control. Leo Sternbach synthesized a molecule that had powerful effects on the brain's GABA receptors, reducing anxiety and inducing calm. Hoffmann-La Roche turned that molecule into a blockbuster drug. Doctors prescribed it by the millions. Patients took it, often for years, often without understanding the risks. And when the problems emerged, the dependence, the tolerance, the brutal withdrawal, it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle, and it would never go back in. By 1965, Valium was everywhere. 2 years after its FDA approval, it had already become one of the most prescribed drugs in America, surpassing even its predecessor Librium. Doctors wrote prescriptions for it with barely a second thought. Patients asked for it by name. And pharmaceutical advertising, both to doctors and increasingly to the general public, positioned Valium as the solution to modern life's tensions, particularly for women. The marketing of Valium to women is one of the most disturbing chapters in pharmaceutical history. It was blatant, gendered, and incredibly effective. Let's examine how Hoffmann-La Roche and other benzodiazepine manufacturers convinced an entire generation of doctors that women's dissatisfaction was a medical condition requiring chemical treatment. First, the advertisements. Pharmaceutical companies in the 1960s and 70s advertised prescription drugs directly to physicians through medical journals, publications like JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, Archives of General Psychiatry, American Journal of Psychiatry, and others. These weren't consumer advertisements. They were aimed at the people who wrote prescriptions. The goal was to shape doctors' perceptions of when and why to prescribe a drug. The Valium advertisements in these journals overwhelmingly featured women. Not just women, but specific types of women in specific situations. The anxious housewife overwhelmed by domestic duties. The single career woman unable to find a husband. The menopausal woman struggling with the change of life. The college student anxious about entering adulthood. The working mother juggling too many responsibilities. The divorced woman adjusting to life alone. The elderly woman facing loneliness. Again and again, the message was the same. Women's emotional responses to difficult life circumstances were pathological and required medication. Let's look at specific examples because the details matter. In 1968, Roche ran an advertisement showing a young woman in a college graduation gown, looking anxious. The caption read, "Leaving college to enter a new world of adult conflicts." The text described the stress of transitioning from student life to adult responsibilities and suggested Valium as a way to smooth this transition. The implication was that normal life transitions, graduating, starting a career, getting married, were so overwhelming for women that they needed pharmaceutical assistance. Another ad from 1970 showed a harried-looking woman surrounded by children, dishes, laundry. The caption, "You can't set her free, but you can help her feel less anxious." Think about that phrasing, "You can't set her free." The advertisement acknowledges that the woman's circumstances are the problem. She's trapped in a role that's overwhelming and unsatisfying. But rather than suggesting any change to those circumstances, it offers medication to make her tolerate them. The cage remains locked. Valium just makes the bird stop noticing the bars. Perhaps most infamous is the 1970 Jan advertisement mentioned earlier. Jan is shown at various ages, 20, 23, 27, 30, 35, each photo documenting her failure to achieve the expected milestones of womanhood, marriage, family, domestic contentment. By 35, Jan is single and psychoneurotic, standing alone on a cruise ship, presumably one of those vacations for lonely spinsters. The text explains that Jan suffers from low self-esteem and has been unable to form lasting relationships with men because no man measures up to her father. This is classic Freudian analysis, suggesting Jan has an electric complex, an unhealthy attachment to her father that prevents normal psychosexual development. The solution? Valium, which will presumably make Jan less neurotic and more marriageable. These advertisements seem almost paradoxically sexist now, but they were part of a consistent strategy. Roche and other benzodiazepine manufacturers were teaching doctors to see women's distress as a medical problem rather than a reasonable response to social conditions. A woman who was anxious about her limited options wasn't experiencing a normal human reaction. She was ill. A woman who felt trapped in domestic life wasn't responding rationally to real constraints. She was neurotic. A woman who wanted more than marriage and motherhood wasn't ambitious, she was maladjusted, and the fix was chemical. Why did this work? Why did doctors, educated, intelligent professionals, accept this framing so readily? Several reasons, all of them rooted in the culture of the time. First, the medical profession in the 1960s and 70s was overwhelmingly male. In 1970, only 7.6% of American physicians were women. Medical education had been hostile to women for generations. The doctors prescribing Valium to female patients were almost always men who had been trained in a system that viewed women as fundamentally different from men, more emotional, less rational, more prone to hysteria. This wasn't conscious misogyny necessarily. It was the accepted medical understanding of sex differences. Freudian psychology, which dominated mid-century psychiatry, held that women's psychology was fundamentally shaped by penis envy, womb-centered anxiety, and difficulties accepting their subordinate role. A woman who expressed anger, ambition, or dissatisfaction was displaying symptoms of neurosis. Second, doctors had limited tools. If a patient came in distressed, what could a physician do? Psychotherapy was expensive and time-consuming. Hospitalization was for extreme cases. Barbiturates were dangerous. Simply telling a woman that her feelings were understandable, that she wasn't sick, that the problem was her circumstances rather than her brain chemistry, this wasn't seen as treatment. Doctors wanted to help, and Valium offered a way to help that was quick, easy, and apparently effective. The patient felt better, she stopped complaining, she could function. From the doctor's perspective, this was a successful intervention. Third, the pharmaceutical industry had enormous influence over medical education and practice. Drug company representatives brought samples, literature, and gifts to doctors' offices. They sponsored continuing medical education seminars, often at pleasant resorts. They funded research and clinical trials. The information doctors received about drugs came primarily from the companies that made them, and those companies emphasized benefits while minimizing risks. Roche's literature on Valium stressed its safety, its low potential for abuse, its minimal side effects, the fact that it caused physical dependence, that tolerance developed requiring higher doses, that withdrawal could be severe. These facts emerged slowly, over years, and were initially dismissed or downplayed. Fourth, prescribing Valium was profitable, not for doctors, but for the pharmaceutical industry, and the industry made sure doctors knew about its products. Between the 1960s and 1980s, Valium generated billions of dollars in revenue for Hoffmann-La Roche. The company spent lavishly on marketing, making Valium one of the most recognized drug names in the world. When patients came to doctors asking for Valium by name, doctors often prescribed it. Brand loyalty created through advertising drove prescription patterns. The result was an epidemic of prescription. By 1975, over 100 million prescriptions for Valium were being written annually in the United States. This was in a country with a population of about 215 million. Even accounting for refills, the number suggests that a substantial portion of the adult population, particularly adult women, were taking Valium regularly. Some estimates suggest that by the late 1970s, 1 in 5 women in America had taken Valium at some point. What did this look like in practice? Imagine you're a 35-year-old woman in 1974. You've been taking Valium for 5 years, since her second child was born, and you felt overwhelmed, anxious, unable to sleep. Your doctor prescribed 5 milligram tablets, 2 per day. They helped, the crushing anxiety eased, you could function. Over time, though, you've noticed that 5 milligrams doesn't do as much. You're taking 3 tablets a day now, sometimes 4. Your doctor refills the prescription without comment. You've tried stopping once just to see if you still need it, and within 2 days you are shaking, sweating, unable to sleep, more anxious than ever. So you started taking it again. You don't think of yourself as addicted. Addiction is for heroin users and alcoholics, not for middle-class housewives taking medicine prescribed by their doctor. You're just taking your medication. Everyone you know is taking something. Valium, Librium, Miltown, Dalmane. It's normal. It's what women do to cope. You don't know that you're physically dependent. You don't know that your brain chemistry has adopted to the constant presence of diazepam, downregulating GABA receptors, so that you now need the drug just to feel normal. You don't know that stopping abruptly could cause seizures. You don't know
that the tolerance you're developing will keep increasing, requiring higher and higher doses. You don't know that years from now, when you try to quit, the withdrawal will be one of the most difficult experiences of your life, lasting months, possibly years, with symptoms that doctors won't believe or understand. You don't know any of this because no one has told you. Your doctor doesn't know, or doesn't think it's important, or assumes you'll be fine. After all, it's just a little pill. In 1966, the Rolling Stones released Mother's Little Helper, a song that perfectly captured the cultural moment. The lyrics, written by Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, describe a housewife using pills to get through her day. Mother needs something today to calm her down, and though she's not really ill, there's a little yellow pill. She goes running for the shelter of a mother's little helper, and it helps her on her way, gets her through her busy day. The song goes on. Doctor, please, some more of these. Outside the door, she took 4 more. What a drag it is getting old.
Mother's Little Helper was the first pop song to directly address middle-class prescription drug dependence. It wasn't about heroin addicts or back-alley drug dealers. It was about ordinary women, mothers, taking medicine prescribed by doctors, slowly sliding into dependency. The song was mildly controversial, but became a hit. It resonated because it was true. Everyone knew a woman like this, or was a woman like this, or was married to a woman like this. Valium had become normalized, invisible, just part of life. The same year Mother's Little Helper was released, 1966, Valium prescriptions in the United States topped 20 million. By 1970, that number had more than doubled. By 1975, Valium was the most prescribed drug in America, surpassing all antibiotics, all blood pressure medications, all painkillers. And the majority of those prescriptions, approximately 2/3, were going to women. Why the gender disparity? Were women genuinely more anxious than men? Or were doctors more likely to interpret women's distress as pathological? Research suggests the latter. Studies from the period show that when men and women presented with identical symptoms of anxiety or depression, doctors were more likely to prescribe psychotropic drugs to women and to recommend that men make lifestyle changes, find stress relief, or simply tough it out. The assumption was that men's distress was situational and temporary, while women's distress was constitutional and chronic. Men had problems. Women were problems. The tragedy is that Valium did help in the short term. It genuinely reduced anxiety, improved sleep, made overwhelming situations feel manageable. For women trapped in difficult circumstances, abusive marriages, isolation, poverty, lack of education or opportunity, Valium offered a brief respite, a few hours of feeling okay. The problem was that it didn't address the underlying causes, and it came with a cost that wasn't acknowledged or explained. The short-term relief came with long-term dependency. And when the reckoning came, when the evidence of harm became undeniable, the women who had been prescribed these drugs by the millions were blamed for taking them. By 1970, Valium had achieved something unprecedented in pharmaceutical history. It had become a cultural phenomenon. It wasn't just a drug, it was a symbol, a shorthand for American anxiety, for modern life's pressures, for the chemical management of emotion. And the numbers were staggering. In 1969, Valium became the most prescribed drug in the United States, a position it would hold for 13 consecutive years until 1982. Think about that. Not the most prescribed psychiatric drug, not the most prescribed anti-anxiety drug, the most prescribed drug of any kind. More than antibiotics, more than blood pressure medication, more than painkillers. Valium was number one. The peak came in 1978. That year, according to data from the Drug Enforcement Administration and pharmaceutical industry reports, 2.3 billion Valium tablets were dispensed in the United States. That's 2,300 million pills. In a country with a population of about 223 million, that's more than 10 pills for every man, woman, and child. Of course, not everyone was taking Valium, but those who were taking it were taking a lot of it. The typical prescription was for 5 milligram tablets to be taken 2 to 4 times daily. At 3 tablets per day, a moderate dose, that's about 1,100 tablets per person per year. If 2.3 billion tablets were dispensed in 1978, that suggests approximately 2 million people were taking Valium regularly at that dose, though the actual number was likely higher because many people were taking lower doses or taking it intermittently. Either way, we're talking about millions of Americans, the vast majority of them women, taking benzodiazepines daily, often for years on end. How did this happen? How did a single drug become so dominant?
First, Valium worked. In the short term, it was genuinely effective. It reduced anxiety, it improved sleep, it relaxed muscles, it stopped panic attacks. For people suffering from debilitating anxiety disorders, Valium could be life-changing. The problem wasn't that it didn't work. The problem was that it worked too well, and that its effectiveness came with costs that weren't fully understood or disclosed. Second, Valium seemed safe. Unlike barbiturates, you couldn't easily overdose on Valium alone. You could take a whole bottle of Valium tablets, and while you'd be extremely sedated and might require medical attention, you probably wouldn't die. This gave doctors confidence to prescribe it liberally. The lethal dose was very high relative to the therapeutic dose, a huge safety margin. What wasn't understood until later was that safety from overdose doesn't mean safety from dependence. Valium might not kill you acutely, but it could trap you in a cycle of tolerance and withdrawal that was extremely difficult to escape. Third, Valium had powerful institutional support. Hoffmann-La Roche was one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies with enormous resources for research, marketing, and lobbying. The company funded studies, sponsored medical conferences, advertised in every major medical journal, and maintained a sales force that visited doctors' offices constantly. Roche's marketing budget for Valium in the 1970s was in the tens of millions of dollars annually, a huge sum for the time. The company made sure that every doctor in America knew about Valium and felt comfortable prescribing it. Fourth, there was enormous demand. Anxiety disorders are common. By some estimates, up to 30% of adults will experience an anxiety disorder at some point in their lives. Add to that the situational anxiety caused by life stress, divorce, job loss, illness, bereavement, financial problems, and you have a huge population of people seeking relief. Valium offered that relief quickly and without the stigma of psychiatric hospitalization or long-term psychotherapy. You could take a pill and feel better. For many people, that was irresistible. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, the culture had changed. By the 1970s, taking psychiatric medication had become normalized, at least for certain populations. The counterculture's embrace of psychedelic drugs, the widespread use of stimulants like amphetamines for weight loss and energy, the growing acceptance of psychiatric diagnoses, all of this created an environment where taking a pill to change how you felt was unremarkable. Valium wasn't seen as a crutch or a weakness. It was seen as medical treatment, no different from taking insulin for diabetes or antibiotics for an infection. But there was a dark side to Valium's ubiquity, a side that was becoming harder to ignore by the mid-1970s. People were becoming dependent. They were developing tolerance, needing higher doses to achieve the same effect. And when they tried to stop, they experienced withdrawal symptoms that were sometimes worse than the original anxiety. Let's talk about tolerance. Benzodiazepines like Valium work by enhancing the effect of gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA, a neurotransmitter that inhibits brain activity. When GABA binds to its receptors, neurons become less excitable, which produces calming, sedative, and anti-anxiety effects. Benzodiazepines make GABA more effective at these receptors. The problem is that the brain adapts. When benzodiazepines are present constantly, the brain downregulates GABA receptors. It produces fewer of them or makes them less sensitive to maintain balance. This is tolerance. After weeks or months of daily use, the same dose of Valium produces less effect. You need more to feel calm, but increasing the dose just accelerates the adaptation. You're on a treadmill, running faster just to stay in place. Tolerance was noticed early, but it was often attributed to the patient rather than the drug. If a patient said Valium wasn't working as well anymore, the doctor might increase the dose, or might tell the patient to take it only as needed rather than daily, or might suggest that the patient's anxiety was worsening. The idea that the drug itself was causing the problem, that the brain was adapting in ways that created new problems, wasn't widely understood until the late 1970s. And then there was withdrawal. Physical dependence on benzodiazepines develops quickly, often within weeks of daily use. When the drug is stopped or reduced, the brain, which has adapted to its constant presence, reacts with a storm of symptoms. Anxiety, often worse than the original anxiety that led to taking Valium, insomnia, tremors, sweating, rapid heartbeat, muscle tension, headaches, nausea, and in severe cases, seizures. These symptoms can begin within hours of the last dose, peak within a few days, and last for weeks or even months as the brain slowly readjusts. The cruelty of benzodiazepine withdrawal
is that it mimics and amplifies the symptoms the drug was prescribed to treat. You took Valium for anxiety. When you try to stop, you experience overwhelming anxiety. The natural conclusion is that you need the drug, that your original condition has returned. In many cases, doctors told patients exactly this: your anxiety is back, you need to stay on the medication. What they didn't realize or didn't want to admit was that the anxiety might be withdrawal, not relapse. The drug had become the problem. By the mid-1970s, reports were accumulating in the medical literature. Studies from the United Kingdom, Scandinavia, and the United States documented cases of patients who had been taking therapeutic doses of benzodiazepines for months or years and who experienced severe withdrawal symptoms when attempting to discontinue. These weren't people abusing the drugs or taking massive doses. They were ordinary patients following their doctor's instructions, and they were suffering. One of the most important early voices was Dr. Malcolm Lader, a British psychiatrist and psychopharmacologist who studied benzodiazepine dependence in the 1970s and 1980s. later documented that physical dependence could develop at therapeutic doses, that withdrawal could be severe and protracted, and that the medical profession had seriously underestimated the risks of long-term benzodiazepine use. His work was initially controversial. Pharmaceutical companies and many doctors resisted the idea that benzodiazepines were problematic, but it laid the groundwork for later understanding. And then there were the high-profile cases, the celebrities whose struggles with Valium and other benzodiazepines brought public attention to the issue. Betty Ford, wife of President Gerald Ford and First Lady from 1974 to 1977, publicly disclosed in April 1978 that she was addicted to alcohol and prescription pain medication and that she was seeking treatment. Her candor was shocking and courageous. First ladies didn't talk about addiction, but Betty Ford did, and in doing so she opened a national conversation about prescription drug dependence. She later founded the Betty Ford Center, which became one of the most famous addiction treatment facilities in the world. While her primary struggle was with alcohol and opioid pain medications, benzodiazepines were also part of the mix. Many women in her situation were taking Valium or similar drugs along with other substances. Elvis Presley died on August 16, 1977, at age 42. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, but the toxicology report told a more complicated story. Presley's system contained codeine, morphine, diazepam, Valium, methaqualinone, quaaludes, ethanamate, pentobarbital, phenobarbital, meperidine, and several other prescription drugs. He wasn't using illegal drugs. Everything in his system had been prescribed by doctors, but the combination, taken over years, had destroyed his health. Presley's death became a symbol of prescription drug abuse, of doctors prescribing recklessly, of patients taking everything offered without understanding the consequences. Valium was just one piece of the puzzle, but it was there, in his blood, when he died. The Kennedy family, America's closest thing to royalty, was also touched by benzodiazepines and other prescription drugs. David Kennedy, son of Robert F. Kennedy, struggled with addiction throughout his life. He died in 1984 at age 28 from an overdose of cocaine, Demerol, and other drugs. Christopher Lawford, son of Peter Lawford and Patricia Kennedy, wrote openly about his own addiction struggles, which included benzodiazepines. The Kennedy family's tragic history with substance abuse, much of it involving prescription drugs, helped illustrate that addiction didn't discriminate by class or status. In September 1979, Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, youngest brother of President John F. Kennedy and Senator Robert Kennedy, held Senate hearings on the overprescribing of Valium and other benzodiazepines. Kennedy called Valium and Librium drugs that had produced a nightmare of dependence for many people. Witnesses testified about their struggles to quit, about doctors who dismissed their symptoms, about withdrawal that lasted months. Dr. Theodore Cooper, a former Assistant Secretary of Health, testified about the scale of benzodiazepine prescribing and the growing evidence of harm. The hearings generated significant media coverage and helped shift public perception. Valium was no longer seen as harmless. It was now recognized as a drug with serious risks. By the late 1970s, the cultural tide was turning. Investigative journalism pieces appeared in major newspapers and magazines. The New York Times, The Washington Post, and others ran articles questioning the overprescribing of tranquilizers and detailing cases of dependence and withdrawal. Barbara Gordon's 1979 memoir, I'm Dancing as Fast as I Can, became a bestseller. Gordon,
successful television producer, described her terrifying experience of cold turkey withdrawal from Valium, which led to a psychotic break and hospitalization. Her book was raw, honest, and influential, showing that Valium dependence could happen to anyone and that withdrawal could be devastating. The pharmaceutical industry fought back. Hoffmann-La Roche maintained that Valium was safe when used as directed, that dependence occurred only in patients who abused the drug or had underlying addiction problems, and that the benefits far outweighed the risks. The company pointed to millions of people who had taken Valium without problems. And this was partly true. Not everyone who took Valium became dependent, and for some people it was genuinely helpful without causing harm. But the company's position downplayed the real risks and shifted blame onto patients rather than acknowledging that the drug itself, even at therapeutic doses, could cause dependence. In 1980, the Drug Enforcement Administration reclassified benzodiazepines as Schedule IV controlled substances, acknowledging that they had potential for abuse and dependence. This made prescribing slightly more complicated,
Refills were limited and doctors had to follow stricter record-keeping rules, but it didn't stop the flow of prescriptions. Valium remained enormously popular throughout the early 1980s. What finally dethroned Valium wasn't regulation or public outcry, it was the arrival of new drugs. In 1987, Prozac fluoxetine was approved for depression. Prozac was a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, SSRI, a new class of antidepressants that also had anti-anxiety effects. SSRIs didn't cause physical dependence in the same way benzodiazepines did, and they weren't sedating. They became the new go-to treatment for anxiety and depression, gradually replacing benzodiazepines in many cases. By the early 1990s, Prozac and related SSRIs had become the most prescribed psychiatric medications, and Valium had slipped from its throne. But Valium didn't disappear. Diazepam is still prescribed today, though less commonly than in its heyday, and the benzodiazepine class as a whole remains one of the most prescribed drug categories in the world. Valium may have faded, but its descendants, Xanax, Klonopin, Ativan, and others, have taken its place. The problem wasn't solved, it just changed names. Now we need to talk about what happens when you stop, because this is where the story gets truly dark. Benzodiazepine withdrawal is one of the most brutal experiences the human body and mind can endure, and for decades it was denied, minimized, or blamed on the patient. First, understand that benzodiazepine withdrawal is not psychological. It's not in your head or a matter of willpower. It is a profound physiological process caused by the brain and nervous system's adaptation to chronic benzodiazepine exposure and subsequent attempt to function without it. When you take a benzodiazepine daily for weeks, months, or years, your brain changes. GABA receptors downregulate. The brain reduces its sensitivity to GABA's inhibitory effects because the benzodiazepine has been artificially enhancing those effects. This is a survival mechanism, the brain trying to maintain equilibrium. But when the benzodiazepine is removed, suddenly the brake system that keeps the nervous system from overexciting is severely impaired. The result is a storm of hyperexcitability, anxiety, insomnia, tremors, muscle spasms, sensory distortions, and in severe cases, seizures that can be life-threatening. The symptoms of benzodiazepine withdrawal are extensive and often bizarre. Let's go through them, because understanding the full picture is important. Psychological symptoms. Severe anxiety, often worse than the original anxiety that led to taking benzodiazepines. Panic attacks, depression, sometimes profound with suicidal ideation, irritability and rage, confusion and difficulty concentrating, memory problems, derealization, the feeling that the world isn't real, depersonalization, the feeling that you aren't real, that you're observing yourself from outside your body, intrusive thoughts, hallucinations in severe cases. Physical symptoms, insomnia, sometimes complete inability to sleep for days, tremors, usually in the hands but sometimes generalization, muscle pain, tension, spasms, twitching, headaches, often severe, sweating, chills, temperature dysregulation, rapid heartbeat, palpitations, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, loss of appetite and weight loss, tingling and numbness in extremities, sensitivity to light, sound, touch, smell, the world becomes painfully intense, tinnitus, ringing in the ears, visual disturbances, seeing things shimmer or move when they're still, balance problems and dizziness, seizures, which can occur especially if withdrawal is abrupt. The timeline is unpredictable. Acute withdrawal typically begins within hours to a few days of the last dose, depending on the benzodiazepine's half-life.
Short-acting benzos like Xanax, alprazolam, cause withdrawal symptoms quickly, sometimes within 6 to 8 hours. Long-acting benzos like Valium, diazepam can take several days before symptoms begin. Acute withdrawal peaks within the first week or two and then gradually improves over the following weeks. But for many people, that's not the end. There's something called post-acute withdrawal syndrome, or protracted withdrawal. This is where symptoms persist for months, sometimes years after the drug has been discontinued. Pause symptoms are usually less intense than acute withdrawal, but can be deeply disabling. Ongoing anxiety, depression, cognitive impairment, insomnia, and physical symptoms like muscle pain and sensory disturbances. The brain is slowly healing, rebuilding GABA receptors, restoring balance, but the process is agonizingly slow. Some people report symptoms lasting 2 years or more. The medical establishment was slow to acknowledge this. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, many doctors insisted that benzodiazepine withdrawal was mild and brief, similar to stopping coffee, uncomfortable but not dangerous. When patients reported severe, protracted symptoms, they were often told they were experiencing a relapse of their original anxiety disorder and should resume taking the drug.
Or they were told the symptoms were psychosomatic, that they were exaggerating, that they needed psychiatric help for underlying mental illness. This gaslighting, because that's what it was, caused immense suffering. Imagine going through the worst experience of your life and being told it's not real, that you're imagining it, that you're the problem. One of the heroes of the story is Professor Heather Ashton, a British psychopharmacologist who dedicated much of her career to understanding and helping people withdraw from benzodiazepines. Born on July 11, 1929 in Dehradun, India, Ashton trained as a physician and specialized in psychopharmacology. From 1982 to 1994, she ran a benzodiazepine withdrawal clinic at the Royal Victoria Infirmary in Newcastle upon Tyne, England. Over those 12 years, she worked with hundreds of patients who were struggling to get off benzodiazepines, most of whom had been prescribed the drugs by their doctors for anxiety or insomnia and had been taking them for years. What Ashton discovered through clinical experience was that slow, careful tapering was essential. Stopping benzodiazepines abruptly, cold turkey, was dangerous and caused the most severe symptoms, including risk of seizures. But even with tapering, many patients experienced prolonged withdrawal that lasted months. Ashton developed protocols for gradual dose reduction, often substituting longer-acting benzodiazepines like diazepam, Valium, for shorter-acting ones like alprazolam, Axan, or lorazepam, Ativan, then slowly reducing the diazepam dose over many months. Her approach was compassionate, evidence-based, and patient-centered. In 2002, Ashton published Benzodiazepines, How They Work and How to Withdraw, a manual that became known simply as the Ashton Manual. It was a comprehensive guide to benzodiazepine withdrawal, including detailed tapering schedules, explanations of symptoms, and reassurance that recovery was possible. The manual was made freely available online and has been translated into multiple languages. It became a lifeline for people around the world who were struggling to withdraw and couldn't find doctors who understood what they were going through. Heather Ashton died on September 15, 1999 at age 90. Her legacy is the thousands of people she helped and the change in medical understanding she helped bring about. Research has gradually confirmed what Ashton observed. A study published by the FDA itself noted that patients can become physically dependent on benzodiazepines as little as several days of use. The FDA analyzed adverse event reports and found that approximately 80% described benzodiazepine withdrawal symptoms, including severe anxiety, insomnia, panic attacks, seizures, and other central nervous system effects. Another study found that up to 44% of long-term benzodiazepine users experience persistent moderate to severe withdrawal symptoms when attempting to discontinue. These are not small percentages. This is a significant proportion of users experiencing serious harm. The FDA now requires boxed warnings, the strongest type of warning, on benzodiazepines, stating that physical dependence and withdrawal reactions can occur even at therapeutic doses, that abrupt discontinuation can cause serious symptoms, including seizures, and that benzodiazepine should be used only for short periods and tapered carefully when discontinuing. This warning was updated in 2020, more than 50 years after Valium was first approved. For the millions of people who became dependent in the intervening decades, the warning came too late. Let me tell you what withdrawal actually feels like, based on
countless first-hand accounts. You've been taking Valium, let's say 10 milligrams per day, for 3 years. Your doctor agrees you should stop and suggests reducing by half for a week, then stopping completely. You follow the instructions. Within 3 days of your last dose, you wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, your heart pounding so hard you think you're having a heart attack. You feel terror, pure and overwhelming, unlike anything you've experienced before. Your hands shake. You can't eat because you're nauseous. Sounds are painfully loud. Your spouse's voice, the refrigerator hum, traffic outside. All of it grates on your nerves like sandpaper. Your skin crawls and tingles. You can't sleep, not even for a few minutes. When you close your eyes, you see flashes of light and geometric patterns. You feel disconnected from your body, like you're floating a few inches above yourself. You call your doctor, desperate. The doctor says this is just anxiety, that you were dependent on the drug, and now your original anxiety has returned. You need to learn to cope without medication. Maybe some therapy would help, or maybe you should go back on the Valium at a lower dose. You feel crazy. You feel abandoned. You search online and find forums full of people describing exactly what you're experiencing. They call it benzo withdrawal. They warn that it can last months. They share tapering schedules, slower, much slower than what your doctor suggested. You realize you need to find a doctor who understands, or you need to figure this out yourself. This scenario played out thousands of times in the 1980s and 1990s, and it still plays out today. The medical system created a dependence epidemic, then failed to help people escape it. The onus was placed on patients to educate themselves, to advocate for slow tapers, to endorse symptoms that were denied or dismissed. Support groups formed, first in person and then online, where people shared information, encouraged each other, marked milestones, 1 month off, 6 months off, a year off. Recovery was measured in seasons and years, not days and weeks.